There is something uniquely haunting about the disappearance of an entire family. One person vanishing is tragedy enough, but when a mother, a father, and their children all slip away from the world without explanation, it leaves behind a void that feels almost impossible to comprehend. The houses stand empty, the cars remain parked in driveways, and the belongings gather dust, while the questions multiply with each passing day. Tonight, we explore some of the most disturbing cases in which entire families simply cease to exist, leaving nothing behind but unanswered questions and the lingering hope that somehow, somewhere, the truth might still be waiting to be found. It was Christmas Eve in 1945, and the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, was blanketed in the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The Sodder family lived in a modest two-story house on a quiet road, surrounded by the rolling hills and dense forests of Appalachian coal country. George Sodder, an Italian immigrant who had worked his way up from nothing, ran a successful coal trucking business. His wife Jenny had given him 10 children, 9 of whom were home that night. The oldest son, Joe, had been discharged from the army just the day before and was the only one not present. The rest of the family was gathered together, celebrating the holiday in what should have been a scene of warmth and joy. The Sodder children who were home that night ranged in age from 2 years old to 23. The younger ones, Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, Jenny, who was 8, and Betty, who was 5, had been allowed to stay up late because it was Christmas Eve. They played with the toys their older sister Marion had bought them while their parents retired to bed around 10:30 that evening. Jenny Sodder fell asleep with the youngest 3-year-old Sylvia beside her. The older children, including Marion, George Jr., and John, were also in the house. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, the kind that families remember for generations. But sometime after midnight, Jenny Sodder was jolted awake by the sound of the telephone ringing. She hurried downstairs to answer it, expecting perhaps a late holiday greeting or some family emergency. Instead, she heard a woman's voice she did not recognize. The caller was asking for someone whose name Jenny did not know. When Jenny told her she had the wrong number, the woman laughed strangely and hung up. It was an odd interaction, one that would seem far more sinister in hindsight. As Jenny made her way back to bed, she noticed that the curtains in the living room had not been drawn and that the lights were still on, evidence that the younger children had indeed stayed up late. She switched off the lights and went back upstairs. She had been asleep for perhaps half an hour when she was awakened again, this time by a sound on the roof. It was a rolling, thudding noise, as though something had been thrown onto the roof and was sliding down the shingles. Jenny got up again, but could see nothing unusual in the darkness outside. She returned to bed once more, trying to shake the unease that was beginning to settle over her. Then, around 1 in the morning, she smelled smoke. What happened next unfolded with the sickening speed of a nightmare. Jenny woke George, and the two of them rushed through the house, trying to reach their children. The fire was spreading rapidly, consuming the downstairs rooms with terrifying speed. The staircase leading to the upper floor where the 5 younger children slept was already engulfed in flames. George tried desperately to reach them, but the heat drove him back. Marion, George Jr., John, and little Sylvia managed to escape, but Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty remained trapped upstairs. In desperation, George ran outside to get his ladder, the one that always stood propped against the side of the house. But the ladder was gone. It was nowhere to be found. He then tried to start one of his 2 coal trucks, thinking he could drive it close to the house and climb onto the roof. Neither truck would start, even though both had been running perfectly fine just the day before. A barrel of water he kept near the house for emergencies was frozen solid. The telephone, when he tried to call for help, was dead. Everything that could have helped him save his children had been rendered useless. By the time Marion ran to a neighbor's house and the neighbor drove into town to find the fire chief, precious time had been lost. The fire department did not arrive until 8 o'clock in the morning, nearly 7 hours after the fire began. By then, the 2-story house had been reduced to a smoldering pile of ash in the basement. Fire Chief F.J. Morris surveyed the scene and told the grieving parents that the fire had burned so hot that the children's bodies had been completely cremated. There was nothing left to recover. The coroner's office issued 5 death certificates just before the new year, listing the causes of death as fire or suffocation. But George and Jenny Sodder could not accept this explanation, and as the initial shock began to fade, troubling questions began to emerge. First, there was the matter of the missing bodies. George had worked around coal fires his entire life. He knew how hot a fire needed to burn to completely destroy a human body, and a house fire, even a severe one, simply did not burn hot enough. A crematorium, which operates at temperatures far exceeding any ordinary fire, still leaves behind bones and teeth. Yet in the Sodder home, not a single bone fragment was found. Not a tooth, not a vertebra, not a single piece of physical evidence that 5 children had died in that basement. Then there were the strange events that had preceded the fire. In October of that year, just 2 months before the tragedy, a life insurance salesman had come to the house. When George refused to buy a policy, the man had become angry and issued a chilling warning. He told George that his house was going to go up in smoke and that his children were going to be destroyed. He attributed this to what he called the dirty remarks George had been making about Mussolini. George, who had become a naturalized American citizen and was outspoken in his criticism of the Italian dictator, had made no secret of his political views. But he had not thought much of the salesman's threat at the time. There was also the matter of a man who had come to the house claiming to look for work. He had wandered around to the back of the property and pointed to the fuse boxes, commenting that they would cause a fire someday. George found this puzzling because he had just had the house rewired after installing an electric stove, and the power company had certified that everything was safe. And in the weeks before Christmas, the older Sodder sons had noticed a strange car parked along the road, its occupants watching the younger children as they returned home from school. On the night of the fire itself, several witnesses reported seeing the children after the blaze had started. A woman who ran a hotel in Charleston claimed that about a week after the fire, she had seen the 5 Sodder children come into her establishment around midnight, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women who appeared to be of Italian descent. Another witness claimed to have seen the children being driven through Charleston in a car. And then there was the matter of the telephone call Jenny had received just before the fire began, the strange woman asking for someone Jenny did not know, the bizarre laughter before the line went dead. George Sodder became convinced that his children had not died in the fire at all. He believed they had been kidnapped, taken from the house before or during the blaze, and that the fire had been set to cover up the crime. He devoted the rest of his life to searching for them. In 1952, he erected a billboard along Route 16 near the site of the house, featuring photographs of the 5 missing children and offering a reward for any information that could help solve the mystery. The billboard would remain standing for decades, becoming a landmark in the area and keeping the case alive in the public consciousness. In 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, Jenny Sodder received an envelope in the mail. Inside was a photograph of a young man, along with a cryptic message on the back. The message suggested that the man in the photograph was Louis Sodder, one of the missing children. The photograph showed a man who bore a striking resemblance to what Louis might have looked like as an adult. The handwriting on the back appeared to be Louis's, based on comparisons with samples from his childhood. The postmark was from Kentucky. But when investigators tried to trace the origin of the photograph, the trail went cold. No one could explain who had sent it or why. George Sodder died in 1969, still haunted by the mystery of his missing children. Jenny passed away in 1989, having never received the answers she so desperately sought. After her death, the billboard was finally taken down. The youngest surviving child, Sylvia, spent much of her life continuing her parents' search for the truth. She passed away in 2021 at the age of 79, without ever learning what happened to her brothers and sisters. The family's pursuit of the truth led them down many paths over the years. In 1949, George had the site of the house excavated, hoping to find definitive evidence of what had happened to his children. During the dig, workers unearthed several small bones, including what appeared to be human vertebrae. For the Sodders, this seemed like it might finally provide answers. George sent the bones to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis, hoping that science could tell him whether his children had died in the fire. The results, when they came back, only deepened the mystery. The Smithsonian concluded that the bones belonged to a single individual, likely a male between the ages of 16 and 22. The report noted that it was possible, though not probable, for a 14-year-old like Maurice to have the skeletal maturation of someone older. But what was most puzzling was that the bones showed no evidence of fire damage. If the children had died in a blaze hot enough to completely destroy their bodies, how could these bones, found at the same site, remain uncharred? Some investigators later speculated that the bones might have come from the fill dirt used to cover the basement, that they had been introduced to the site inadvertently, rather than being remains of the fire victims. The West Virginia legislature held 2 hearings on the case in 1950, examining the evidence and questioning witnesses. But in the end, Governor Oki Pattison and the state police superintendent told the Sodders that the case was hopeless and officially closed it at the state level. George and Jenny refused to accept this verdict. They continued their private investigation, hiring detectives, following up on tips, and traveling across the country whenever a possible sighting of their children was reported. To this day, the fate of the 5 Sodder children remains unknown. Many investigators and authors who have examined the case believe that the children did perish in the fire, that the intensity of the blaze and the subsequent collapse of the house simply buried their remains beyond detection. Fire professionals point out that when young children feel heat and smell smoke, their instinct is often to hide rather than flee, which might explain why no one heard them cry out. Others continue to believe that something far more sinister took place that Christmas Eve, that the children were taken by someone with a grudge against their father, and that the fire was merely a distraction designed to cover up a kidnapping. The mysterious circumstances, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the severed phone line, the delayed fire department response, all point to premeditation and planning that seems inconsistent with a simple house fire. Nearly 15 years after that tragic Christmas in West Virginia, another family would meet a similarly horrific fate, this time in the warm climate of Central Florida. The Walker family lived on the vast Palmer Ranch in Osprey, a small community about an hour south of Tampa. Cliff Walker was 25 years old, a hard-working ranch hand who had married his sweetheart Christine just a few years earlier. They had two beautiful children, a 3-year-old son named Jimmy and a baby girl named Debbie, who was just 23 months old. It was December of 1959, and the family was preparing for Christmas. Their modest wood frame cottage sat isolated on the ranch, surrounded by pasture land and hardwood forest. Their nearest neighbor was half a mile away. On the evening of December 19th, the Walkers had been out running errands, picking up last-minute items for the holiday. Christine returned to the house first, with the children around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She had barely enough time to put away the groceries before she was attacked. The evidence would later suggest that she fought back desperately, using her high-heeled shoes as weapons. Blood was found on the pumps, indicating she had struck her attacker hard enough to draw blood. But her efforts were not enough. Christine was beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot in the head. Cliff arrived home shortly after with little Jimmy. He was ambushed the moment he walked through the door. The young father was shot in the right eye at close range, falling in the living room while still wearing his straw cowboy hat. Jimmy, the 3-year-old, tried to crawl to his father's side. The blood smeared on his clothes and in his hair showed that he had been close to his father when he was shot 3 times in the head. Baby Debbie was found in the bathroom, face down in the bathtub with about 4 inches of water. She had been shot once in the head and then either drowned or left to drown. The bodies were discovered the next morning when a ranch worker named Dan McLeod came by to meet Cliff for a planned hunting trip. The scene that greeted him was one of unimaginable horror. Christmas presents were still wrapped beneath the tree. The house showed no signs of forced entry, suggesting that Christine had let her killer inside, possibly because she recognized them, or because they had presented themselves as harmless. Physical evidence at the scene included a bloody cowboy boot print, a cellophane strip from a cool cigarette wrapper, and a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet. But despite these clues, investigators would spend decades trying to identify the killer. The case attracted national attention in part because of its proximity to another infamous crime. Just 5 weeks before the Walker family was murdered, on November 15, 1959, a farming family named the Clutters had been murdered in Holcomb, Kansas. That crime would later be immortalized in Truman Capote's groundbreaking true crime book, In Cold Blood. The two killers, Perry Smith and Dick Hickok, had fled Kansas after the murders and made their way to Florida, where they were spotted multiple times between Tallahassee and Miami. On the morning of December 19th, the same day the Walkers were killed, Smith and Hickok checked out of a motel in Miami Beach, just a few hours' drive from Osprey. Later that same day, the two men were seen shopping at a department store in Sarasota, just a few miles from the Walker home. One witness noticed that one of them had scratches on his face. Investigators theorized that Smith and Hickok might have encountered the Walkers while trying to sell their stolen car, a 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air. Records showed that Cliff Walker had been in the market for exactly that make and model. Perhaps the killers had knocked on the door claiming to have a car for sale, and Christine had let them in. Smith and Hickok were arrested in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959, and were eventually tried and convicted for the Clutter murders. They were hanged on April 14, 1965. During their incarceration, both men were questioned about the Walker case. They were given polygraph tests, which they appeared to pass, and investigators at the time concluded they could not have committed the Florida murders. Truman Capote even addressed the Walker case in Cold Blood, dismissing the connection based on what he claimed was a solid alibi. But decades later, in 2012, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office reopened the investigation and requested that Smith and Hickok's bodies be exhumed for DNA testing. Investigators hope to compare genetic material from the killers with semen found at the Walker crime scene. The bodies were exhumed in December of 2012, but when the results came back in August of 2013, they were inconclusive. Too much time had passed, and the DNA samples were too degraded to provide a definitive match. The case remains officially unsolved. Some investigators have shifted their focus to local suspects, including a neighbor named William Tooker, who reportedly had an infatuation with Christine and had been seen visiting the Walker home frequently. Tooker lacked an alibi for the afternoon of December 19th and returned to the crime scene twice after the bodies were discovered, behavior that raised suspicions. But Tooker died in 1963 without ever being charged. More recent DNA testing in 2019 identified genetic material from an unknown male at the scene, but no match has been found. The Walker family murder remains one of Florida's oldest unsolved homicides, a shadow that still hangs over the small community of Osprey more than 60 years later. Across the Pacific Ocean, in the seaside city of Adelaide, Australia, another family tragedy was about to unfold that would forever change how an entire nation viewed child safety. It was January 26, 1966, Australia Day, the country's most celebrated holiday. The weather was oppressively hot, the kind of summer day that sent families flocking to the beaches to escape the heat. Among them were the Beaumont children, Jane, who was 9, Arna, who was 7, and Grant, who was 4. The 3 siblings lived with their parents, Jim and Nancy Beaumont, in a modest home on Harding Street in Somerton Park, just a short bus ride from Glenelg Beach, one of Adelaide's most popular seaside destinations. The children had visited the beach many times before, sometimes with their father and sometimes on their own. In 1966, this was not considered unusual. Australia was a country where children were trusted to play outside unsupervised, where neighbors looked out for each other, and where the dangers that lurked in the wider world seemed impossibly distant. That morning, Nancy Beaumont walked her 3 children to the bus stop and waved goodbye as they boarded the 10:15 bus for the 5-minute ride to Glenelg. She gave Jane 8 shillings and 6pence, enough money to buy lunch and bus fare home. The children were expected back by 2 o'clock, but when that hour came and went, Nancy felt the first stirrings of concern. She walked to the bus stop to meet them, but they did not arrive. She returned home, hoping they had simply lost track of time. But as the afternoon stretched on with no sign of the children, her worry turned to fear. Jim Beaumont arrived home from work and immediately drove to the beach to search for his children. Finding no trace of them, he reported them missing to the Glenelg police. What followed was one of the largest search operations in Australian history. Police, volunteers, and even military personnel combed the beach and surrounding areas. Hundreds of officers conducted door-to-door inquiries. The case made headlines across the country and around the world, capturing the attention of millions who anxiously awaited news of the missing children. Witnesses soon came forward with reports of having seen the Beaumont children at the beach that day. Several people recalled seeing them playing near the Collie Reserve sprinklers and swimming by the jetty. More troubling were the reports that the children had been seen in the company of a tall, thin man with a suntan, apparently in his mid-30s. He was described as having fair hair and a thin face. Witnesses said the children seemed comfortable with him, as though they knew him. He was seen playing with them on the beach and buying them lunch at a nearby shop. The man was never identified. A composite sketch was created and widely circulated, but despite thousands of tips, no conclusive identification was ever made. The children simply vanished, leaving behind not a single trace. Their belongings, including their beach towels and bag, were never recovered. It was as though they had been swallowed by the earth. The investigation that followed was massive in scope, but frustrating in its lack of results. Police interviewed thousands of people, followed up on every lead, and conducted searches that extended far beyond the Glenelg area. Reports of sightings came in for months, some from as far away as other states and even other countries. But none could be verified. The children had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. One of the most troubling aspects of the case was the evidence that suggested the children had willingly accompanied their abductor. Witnesses at a local shop reported that Jane had purchased lunch that day, including meat pies and pasties, far more food than the three children would normally eat. This suggested she was buying food for someone else, possibly the man seen with them on the beach. Jane had also spent more money than her mother had given her, meaning she had received money from somewhere, possibly from the stranger. The postman who delivered mail to the Beaumont home the day after the children disappeared reported seeing a strange man near the house. The man appeared to be waiting for someone, or watching the property. This sighting raised terrifying possibilities about whether the abductor had known where the children lived, whether he had stalked them before that fateful day at the beach. The disappearance of the Beaumont children shattered Australia's sense of innocence. Parents who had once thought nothing of letting their children play unsupervised became fearful and vigilant. The case marked a turning point in Australian society, a moment when the nation realized that its children were not safe, that evil could exist even in the most ordinary of places. Over the years, countless theories and suspects emerged, but none led to the children's recovery. In 1966, a Dutch psychic named Gerard Croiset was brought to Australia by a wealthy businessman who hoped Croiset could solve the case. The psychic claimed he had a vision of the children's bodies buried beneath the floor of an old factory. Despite the lack of evidence supporting his claim, the publicity surrounding Croiset's involvement was intense. In 1967, a building he had identified was partially demolished, and an excavation was conducted under the glare of television cameras. Nothing was found. The exercise was later dismissed as a failed publicity stunt, but it illustrated the desperation felt by both the family and the public. Over the decades, several suspects were investigated in connection with the case. One of the most prominent was Bevan Spencer von Einem, a convicted murderer who was sentenced to life in prison in 1984 for killing a teenage boy. Von Einem bore a physical resemblance to the composite sketch, and police came to suspect his involvement in the Beaumont disappearance. However, no concrete evidence has ever linked him to the crime. Another suspect was James O'Neill, who was convicted in 1975 for murdering a child in Tasmania and reportedly told acquaintances he was responsible for the Beaumont disappearance. But again, no proof was ever found. In 2013, and again in 2018, excavations were conducted at a former factory in North Plimpton after two brothers alleged that the building's late owner, Harry Phipps, had ordered them to dig a pit on the property on Australia Day 1966. Phipps's son Hayden also claimed his father had told him he was responsible for the children's disappearance, though other family members disputed this account. ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity tomography were used to search for buried remains, but neither excavation produced evidence of the children. Jim Beaumont died in 2023, Nancy in 2019, both without ever learning what happened to their children. A reward of $1 million Australian dollars remains on offer for information that leads to solving the case. Calls continue for a formal inquest to be held, something that has never occurred despite the passage of nearly 60 years. The Beaumont children remain among Australia's most famous missing persons, their faces frozen in time on posters and in news archives, forever young, forever lost. In the heartland of America, in the quiet city of Springfield, Missouri, the summer of 1992 was supposed to be a time of new beginnings. Suzanne Streeter, known to her friends as Susie, had just graduated from Kickapoo High School alongside her best friend, Stacy McCall. Both young women were 18 years old, standing on the threshold of adulthood, with college plans and bright futures ahead of them. The night of June 6th, their graduation day, was filled with celebration. The girls attended several parties before deciding to spend the night at the home of Susie's mother, Cheryl Levitt. Cheryl was 47 years old, a cosmetologist who worked at a salon called New Attitudes. She was known for her kindness and generosity, the kind of woman who would give you the shirt off her back if you needed it. She had divorced her second husband, Don Levitt, a few years earlier, but kept his surname. She lived with Susie in a tidy house on East Delmar Street, in a neighborhood that felt safe and familiar. On the night of June 6th, Cheryl was expecting Susie and Stacy to come home after the parties. She spoke to a friend on the telephone around 11:15 in the evening. That was the last time anyone heard from her. Susie and Stacy arrived at the house sometime after 2 in the morning. They had originally planned to stay at a friend's house, but when they found it too crowded, they drove to Susie's instead. The next day, June 7th, they were supposed to meet friends to go to a water park. When they did not show up, their friends became concerned. They drove to Cheryl's house and found the front door unlocked, the family dog wandering inside, and no sign of the 3 women. Their purses, including wallets, identification, and money, were still in the house. Their cars were parked in the driveway. Cigarettes, which Cheryl smoked, were left behind. There was no note, no indication that the women had left voluntarily. The only sign that something might be wrong was a broken glass globe from the porch light, its shards scattered on the concrete. One of the friends who arrived that morning swept up the glass, not realizing she might be destroying evidence. By the time police arrived that evening, the crime scene had been contaminated by as many as 20 people who had come and gone from the house, tidying up, emptying ashtrays, and washing coffee cups. Whatever clues might have been left behind were compromised or destroyed. Police also discovered that the answering machine showed evidence of a deleted message. Someone had listened to it and erased it before investigators arrived. To this day, no one knows who left that message or what it contained. It might have been nothing, or it might have been the key to everything. In the absence of information, speculation flourished. In the days that followed, the investigation faced obstacles at every turn. 3 mysterious phone calls came into the house while Stacy's mother, Janice McCall, was there waiting for news. The calls contained what Janice described as lewd sexual content, though she has never revealed the specific words that were spoken. On New Year's Eve of 1992, a man called the America's Most Wanted hotline with what police described as prime knowledge of the abductions. But before investigators could speak with him directly, The call was disconnected. The man never called back, despite public appeals for him to come forward. Over the years, several suspects emerged in connection with the case. The most prominent was Robert Craig Cox, a convicted kidnapper and robber who had been living in Springfield at the time of the disappearance. Cox had a violent criminal history, including a death sentence in Florida that was later overturned. In 1997, while imprisoned in Texas, Cox told a reporter that he knew the three women were dead and that their bodies would never be found. He has never revealed how he knows this or whether he was involved in their deaths. When pressed, Cox has said he will disclose what happened after his mother dies. As of now, he remains in prison, and his mother, in her 90s, is still alive. Another theory centered on the hospital parking garage at Cox Medical Center, which was under construction at the time of the disappearance. A tipster claimed that the women's bodies had been buried in the concrete foundation. In 2007, a crime reporter invited a mechanical engineer to scan a corner of the garage with ground-penetrating radar. The results suggested anomalies beneath the surface, but the hospital refused to allow excavation without more conclusive evidence. The case remains officially unsolved, and Cheryl Levitt and Susie Streeter were declared legally dead in 1997. Stacy McCall has never been declared dead, and her mother continues to hope for answers. For the families left behind, the passage of time has brought no peace. Janice McCall has spent more than 3 decades searching for her daughter, attending vigils, speaking to journalists, and following every potential lead, no matter how slim. The posters bearing the images of the 3 women still hang in shop windows around Springfield, their faces frozen in 1992, forever young and smiling. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, the community gathers to remember them, to keep their memory alive, and to renew calls for anyone with information to come forward. The Springfield Police Department maintains that the case is still active, though the years have taken their toll on the investigation. Witnesses have died, memories have faded, evidence has been lost or degraded. Yet the detectives who have worked the case over the years remain committed to finding answers. They continue to follow up on tips, re-examine evidence with modern forensic techniques, and wait for the breakthrough that might finally crack the case. The FBI has also remained involved, providing assistance and resources whenever new developments emerge. The tragedy of the Springfield Three extends beyond the loss of 3 lives. It represents the destruction of an entire future, the weddings and grandchildren and careers that will never be. For Stacy McCall's family, there is the added agony of not knowing whether she might still be alive somewhere, living a different life under a different name. The uncertainty is perhaps the cruelest aspect of all, the inability to grieve properly, to find closure, to move forward. In the end, what happened to Cheryl, Susie, and Stacy may forever remain a mystery. A cautionary tale about how quickly safety can become an illusion and how completely 3 lives can vanish without a trace. In the remote wilderness of southeastern Oklahoma, another family would vanish under circumstances so bizarre that investigators have never been able to explain what happened. Bobby Jamison was 44 years old in October of 2009, living with his wife Sherilyn, who was 40, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison in the small town of Eufaula. By all accounts, the family had been going through a difficult period. Both Bobby and Sherilyn were on disability and unemployed. Bobby suffered from chronic back pain following a car accident in 2003. The couple had become increasingly reclusive and paranoid in the months leading up to their disappearance. Before they vanished, the Jamisons exhibited behavior that puzzled their friends and family. Bobby had told his pastor that he believed the family's home was haunted, that he had seen spirits on the roof. Sherilyn had purchased a satanic Bible, which Bobby admitted to his pastor he had read. She also spray-painted strange messages on the side of a metal storage container the family owned, including one that read, "Witches do not like it when their cats are killed." Someone, Sherilyn claimed, had poisoned her cats in the weeks before the family disappeared. The family had also been embroiled in a bitter dispute with Bobby's father, Bob Dean Jamison. Bobby had filed for a protection order against his father, claiming the older man had threatened him and once even hit him with his vehicle. Bobby was in the process of suing his father at the time of the disappearance, claiming he was owed money for work he had done at his father's gas station. The relationship between father and son was toxic, filled with accusations and animosity. On October 8, 2009, the Jamison family drove to a remote area near the Sanbois Mountains in Latimer County, about an hour from their home. They were there to look at a 40-acre plot of land they were considering purchasing. Their plan, apparently, was to live off the grid in a metal shipping container. They had declined an offer from their real estate agent to accompany them to the property. That was the last time anyone saw them alive. 9 days later, on October 17th, hunters on dirt bikes stumbled upon the Jamison family's pickup truck abandoned on a remote dirt road near the town of Kinta. The truck was still locked, and inside were belongings that should never have been left behind. Bobby's wallet was there, as was Sherilyn's purse. Their cell phones and GPS system were found inside. Most disturbingly, an envelope containing approximately $32,000 in cash was discovered in the truck. The family dog, a small brown mutt named Maisie, was still in the vehicle, malnourished and dehydrated, but alive. A massive search was launched, involving hundreds of volunteers and law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. Helicopters flew over the area. Dogs were brought in to track the family's scent. But despite weeks of searching, no trace of the Jamisons was found. It was as though they had simply walked away from their truck and vanished into the dense wilderness. Investigators reviewed security footage from the Jamison home taken on the day they left. The video showed Bobby and Sherilyn making multiple trips between the house and the truck, loading their belongings. What struck investigators was how strange they both looked. They moved slowly, almost robotically, with blank expressions on their faces. Neither appeared to speak to the other during the entire loading process. Investigators described their behavior as trance-like, fueling speculation about drugs, mental illness, or something even more sinister. For more than 4 years, the fate of the Jamison family remained unknown. Then, in November of 2013, 2 hunters stumbled upon skeletal remains in a remote area of Latimer County, less than 3 miles from where the family's truck had been found. Extensive forensic testing confirmed in July of 2014 that the remains belonged to Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison Jamison. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, a cause of death could not be determined. One of the skulls appeared to have a small hole that investigators initially suspected might be a bullet wound, but this theory was later abandoned. The mystery of how the Jamisons died and why they left their truck with all their belongings remains unsolved. Theories range from murder, perhaps drug-related given the large amount of cash, to exposure and hypothermia in the cold autumn weather, to suicide. Some have suggested that the family was killed by members of a cult, or that their paranoid beliefs about the supernatural somehow played a role in their demise. The investigators who worked the case admitted they had more leads than they knew what to do with, but that every lead pointed in a different direction. One theory that gained traction involved the area's reputation for drug trafficking. The remote mountains of southeastern Oklahoma had long been known as a corridor for illegal activity, and the $32,000 in cash found in the truck raised obvious questions about whether the Jamisons had been involved in something dangerous. Perhaps they had stumbled upon a drug operation while viewing the property, or perhaps they themselves had been there for reasons other than buying land. But investigators found no concrete evidence linking the family to drug trafficking, and their friends and family insisted they were not involved in anything illegal. Another theory focused on Bobby's troubled relationship with his father. Bob Dean Jamison had been accused of threatening his son's life, and Bobby had filed for a protection order against him. Some wondered whether the elder Jamison had arranged for something to happen to his son and his family. But Bob Dean Jamison died just 2 months after the family disappeared, at the age of 64, and he was never considered a serious suspect by investigators. Then there were the stranger theories, the ones that touched on the family's apparent obsession with the supernatural. Bobby's claims of seeing ghosts, Sherilyn's purchase of the Satanic Bible, the strange messages painted on the storage container. These details painted a picture of a family that may have been mentally unwell, struggling with delusions or paranoia. Some wondered whether they had wandered into the wilderness on some kind of spiritual quest and simply succumbed to the elements. Others speculated about cult involvement, though no evidence of any specific cult was ever found. A particularly disturbing detail that emerged during the investigation was a photograph found on Sherilyn's camera. The image showed their daughter Madison standing alone in the woods, wearing a red hooded jacket that she had not been seen with on the day of the disappearance. The photograph was dated the day the family vanished. Madison's expression in the photo was blank, her eyes vacant. Some investigators wondered whether the photo showed a child who was already traumatized, who knew something terrible was about to happen, or had just happened. Others dismissed it as simply an unflattering snapshot, reading too much into an innocent moment. The truth of what happened to Bobby, Sherilyn, and little Madison Jamison may never be known. Their case stands as one of the most puzzling disappearances in Oklahoma history, a mystery that has defied explanation despite years of investigation and countless hours of detective work. In the suburban sprawl of Southern California, another family would vanish in 2010 under circumstances that initially baffled investigators, but would eventually lead to a stunning resolution. Joseph McStay was 40 years old, a successful businessman who ran a company that manufactured custom decorative water fountains. His wife Summer was 43, a licensed real estate agent who had left her career to focus on raising their 2 young sons, 4-year-old Gianni and 3-year-old Joseph Jr. The family had recently moved into a new home in Fallbrook, a quiet community about an hour north of San Diego. They were renovating the house, building a life, and by all appearances, living the American dream. On February 4th, 2010, everything changed. That morning, Summer spoke with her sister on the telephone. Joseph had a business lunch scheduled with his associate, Charles Merritt, known to friends as Chase. Text messages between Joseph and Summer were exchanged that afternoon until around 5:47 in the evening. After that, there was silence. The family simply disappeared. It was not until February 15th, 11 days later, that relatives became concerned enough to request a wellness check. San Diego County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Fallbrook home and found an eerie scene. The house was empty, but showed no signs of a struggle. food was left on the counter. The family's 2 dogs had been left behind without food or water. Paint cans and renovation supplies were scattered about, evidence of projects left unfinished. The family's white Isuzu Trooper was missing. 4 days later, the Trooper was found abandoned in San Isidro, a border town just steps from the pedestrian crossing into Tijuana, Mexico. This discovery led investigators to theorize that the McStays had voluntarily left the country. Surveillance footage from the border crossing appeared to show a family of 4 walking into Mexico on the night of February 8th. Searches of the family's computers revealed queries about what documents children need for traveling to Mexico and Spanish language lessons. The San Diego Sheriff's Department concluded that the McStays had chosen to disappear and treated the case as a voluntary missing persons matter rather than a crime. But the McStay family's relatives were not convinced. They pointed out that Joseph and Summer had more than $100,000 in their bank accounts, money that remained untouched after their disappearance. Summer's passport was expired. Neither Joseph nor Summer had any reason to flee to Mexico, a country they reportedly avoided because of concerns about safety due to the drug wars. Something did not add up. For nearly 4 years, the McStay family remained missing, the subject of speculation and amateur investigation. Then, in November of 2013, an off-road motorcyclist riding through the Mojave Desert near Victorville, California, spotted something white on the desert sand. It was a skull, small enough to belong to a child. When investigators arrived, they discovered 2 shallow graves containing the remains of 4 people. A sledgehammer was found buried alongside the bodies. Dental records confirmed what many had feared. The remains belonged to Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr. McStay. The investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation, and attention quickly turned to Charles Merritt, the business associate who had been the last known person to see Joseph alive. Merritt had been vocal in the years following the disappearance, appearing on cable news programs to mourn the family and express hope that they would be found. But investigators noticed something troubling in one of his interviews. Merritt had stated that he was most definitely the last person Joseph saw on the day the family vanished. It was an unusual thing to say, and it caught the attention of detectives. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Merritt had a gambling problem and owed Joseph a significant amount of money, reportedly around $42,000 for substandard work he had performed. Even more damning, investigators found that in the weeks after the McStay family disappeared, someone had used Joseph's QuickBooks accounting software to write several checks to Merritt, some of which were backdated to February 4th, the day the family vanished. Merritt's DNA was found on the steering wheel and gear shift of the family's Trooper. Cell phone records placed him near the Mojave Desert gravesite in the days after the family disappeared. In November of 2014, Charles Merritt was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. His trial did not begin until January of 2019, nearly 9 years after the family's disappearance. The prosecution argued that Merritt had killed the McStays in their home, bludgeoning them with a sledgehammer, and then transported their bodies to the desert where he buried them in shallow graves. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial and suggested that another associate of Joseph's might be responsible. In June of 2019, the jury found Charles Merritt guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder. In January of 2020, he was sentenced to death. Because California has a moratorium on the death penalty, Merritt will spend the rest of his life in prison. He continues to maintain his innocence, telling reporters that he would never raise his hand against a woman or child. The McStay case stands out among the family disappearances we have discussed tonight because it is one of the few that has been definitively solved. The family that vanished without a trace was not the victim of random violence or mysterious circumstances. They were murdered by someone they knew and trusted, a family friend who had been welcomed into their home and their lives. Joseph McStay had described Charles Merritt as his best friend, had defended him to family members who expressed doubts, had given him countless chances despite mounting evidence that Merritt was taking advantage of him. In the end, that trust cost Joseph and his entire family their lives. For the relatives of the McStay family, the conviction of Charles Merritt brought a measure of closure, but it could never erase the pain of their loss. Joseph's brother Michael spoke at the sentencing hearing, telling the court that the world was robbed of 4 beautiful souls. The family continues to remember Joseph, Summer, Gianni, and Joseph Jr., keeping their memories alive through tributes and remembrances. Friends who knew the family recall the joy that the McStays brought to those around them, the love that Joseph and Summer shared, the bright futures that their children should have had. The case also serves as a sobering reminder that the people we trust may not always be worthy of that trust. Charles Merritt had been a fixture in Joseph's life, someone he relied on professionally and considered a friend personally. No one in the McStay family suspected that this man would be capable of murdering 4 innocent people, including 2 young children. The betrayal adds another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. In the small town of Morenci, Michigan, not far from the Ohio border, the Thanksgiving holiday of 2010 was supposed to be a time for family. Andrew Skelton was 9 years old, Alexander was 7, and Tanner was 5. They were bright, energetic boys who loved playing outside, watching cartoons, and spending time with their parents. But their parents, John and Tanya Skelton, were in the midst of a bitter divorce. Custody of the children had been awarded to Tanya, but John was allowed visitation for the holiday weekend. On November 25th, Thanksgiving Day, John picked up his 3 sons for what was supposed to be a brief visit. He was required to return them to their mother the following day. But when November 26th arrived, John Skelton did not return the boys. Tanya called him repeatedly, but he did not answer. She drove to his house, but no one was there. Frantic, she called the police. When officers arrived at John's apartment, they found him alone. He had attempted to take his own life and was taken to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation. The boys were nowhere to be found. Over the days and weeks that followed, John Skelton told investigators a series of stories, each more bizarre than the last. At first, he claimed the boys were with friends and would be returned soon. Then he said he had given them to a woman named Joanne Taylor, someone he had met by chance when she had car trouble on the side of the road. He claimed he had entrusted his children to her for safekeeping. When investigators found no evidence that Joanne Taylor existed, John changed his story again. He said he had handed the boys over to an underground organization that would protect them from their mother, whom he accused of being abusive. Sometimes he mentioned the Amish. None of his claims could be substantiated. Cell phone records showed that in the early morning hours of November 26th, John Skelton's phone traveled from Morenci into Ohio, approximately 25 miles away before the phone was turned off. It reappeared in Morenci about 2 hours and 15 minutes later. Investigators believe this window of time is when something happened to the boys, though what exactly remains unknown. Searches were conducted across Michigan and Ohio. Rivers were dragged. Forests were combed. Thousands of tips poured in from across the country. But Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton were never found. In 2011, John Skelton pleaded no contest to 3 counts of unlawful imprisonment. He was sentenced to 10 to 15 years in prison. The charge was essentially an acknowledgement that he had taken his sons and failed to return them, but it stopped short of accusing him of murder because investigators could not prove the boys were dead without finding their bodies. For nearly 15 years, John Skelton sat in prison, maintaining his silence about what he had done with his children. His earliest possible parole date was 2020, but he was denied. He was scheduled for release in late November of 2025, almost exactly 15 years after the boys disappeared. But just weeks before that release date, prosecutors in Lenawee County filed new charges against him. In November of 2025, John Skelton was charged with 3 counts of open murder and 3 counts of tampering with evidence. The new charges came after investigators spent years re-examining the case, following up on tips, and preparing for what they believed would be a crucial moment. A judge had already declared the Skelton brothers legally dead earlier in 2025 at the request of their mother, Tanya. Michigan law typically presumes a person dead after 5 years of being missing. The declaration allowed prosecutors to move forward with murder charges even without recovering the boys' bodies. As of December 2025, the case against John Skelton is proceeding through the courts. New witnesses have come forward, including some who believe they saw his van near a river in Ohio on the day after Thanksgiving in 2010. The investigation continues, and there is hope that after more than a decade, the truth about what happened to Andrew, Alexander, and Tanner Skelton may finally be revealed. These are the stories that keep us awake at night, the cases that defy easy explanation and resist closure. Entire families from different eras and different places, bound together by the same terrible fate. Some of their mysteries have been solved, the truth revealed after years of patient investigation. Others remain open wounds, questions that may never be answered, justice that may never be served. What binds them all together is the reminder that the world can be a dark and unpredictable place, that safety is never guaranteed, and that the people we love can be taken from us in an instant. If you found yourself drawn into these stories, if they made you think about the fragility of life and the importance of holding your loved ones close, then please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. Your support helps us continue to bring these stories to light, to remember those who have been lost, and to keep searching for answers in a world that so often refuses to give them. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and never stop looking for the truth.